My sister smirked when they skipped my name. This small, satisfied smile that spread across her face like she'd just won something she'd been waiting her whole life to win. And I sat there in that cold lawyer's office feeling my stomach drop, feeling the weight of being forgotten settle over me like a heavy blanket. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the lawyer was about to pause, look up from those papers with an expression I couldn't quite read, and say something that would change everything. Our father had passed away 3 weeks earlier, suddenly a heart attack in his sleep, and none of us were ready for it. Not really, even though he'd been sick on and off for years. I was 32 years old, the youngest of 3 children, and I'd always been the one who didn't quite fit into the family. The one who chose a different path, who didn't go into the family business, who moved across the country to build my own life, and because of that I'd always felt like an outsider, like I was tolerated but not truly accepted. My older brother David, 40 years old, had followed in my father's footsteps, took over the business, became the golden child, the son who did everything right, and my sister Rebecca, 37, had stayed close to home, married well, played the role of the perfect daughter, always showing up at family dinners, always saying the right things, always positioning herself as the favorite. The lawyer's office was one of those old, traditional spaces with dark wood paneling, leather chairs, heavy curtains that blocked out most of the daylight, and it smelled like old books and expensive cologne. We sat around a large conference table, David on one side with his wife, Rebecca on the other side with her husband, and me alone at the far end, because I'd flown in by myself, didn't have anyone to bring, didn't have anyone who understood what this family was like. Rebecca kept glancing at me throughout the meeting. These quick little looks that felt like she was sizing me up, measuring how much I knew, how much I expected. And every time our eyes met, she'd smile, this tight, controlled smile that didn't reach her eyes. The lawyer, a man in his 60s named Mr. Harrison, gray-haired and methodical, had been my father's attorney for over 20 years, and he sat at the head of the table with a thick manila folder in front of him, the will, and he began by offering his condolences, talking about what a remarkable man our father had been, how much he'd accomplished, how deeply he'd cared about his family, and I sat there listening, feeling this strange numbness because I wasn't sure my father cared about me the way he cared about David and Rebecca. I wasn't sure I'd ever really mattered to him the way they did. Mr. Harrison opened the folder, adjusted his reading glasses, and began reading the will, his voice steady and formal. And I tried to focus, tried to prepare myself for whatever was coming. He started with the smaller items, personal belongings, my father's watch to David, his cufflinks to David's son, a painting that had hung in the living room for decades to Rebecca. Small things that felt symbolic, like little pieces of my father being distributed to the people he loved, and I noticed that my name hadn't been mentioned yet, not once. Rebecca glanced at me again, and this time her smile was bigger, more confident, like she knew something I didn't, and I felt my chest tighten, felt this creeping sense of dread that maybe I'd been right all along. Maybe I really didn't matter, maybe he'd written me out completely. Then Mr. Harrison moved on to the bigger assets, the family home. Home, a beautiful old house in Connecticut that had been in our family for 3 generations, and he said it would go to David, along with the family business, all the shares, all the control, everything my father had built, and David nodded solemnly, like he'd expected this, like it was his birthright. Rebecca received a significant sum of money, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life, along with a vacation property in the Hamptons that my father had bought years ago. And when Mr. Harrison read that part, Rebecca actually let out a little breath, like she'd been holding it, and she reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. And I saw the relief on her face, the validation. My name still hadn't been mentioned not once, and I felt this cold sinking feeling in my stomach, like I was disappearing, like I was being erased from the family. And I wondered if I should just stand up and leave, if I should walk out of that office and never look back, because what was the point of sitting there if didn't matter if I'd been forgotten? Rebecca looked at me again, and this time she didn't bother hiding her smirk. This triumphant, almost cruel expression that said, "See? I told you, you were never really one of us." And I looked down at my hands, trying to keep my face neutral, trying not to let her see how much this hurt. But then Mr. Harrison paused, stopped reading mid-sentence, and looked up from the papers with this strange expression, something between surprise and confusion, and he cleared his throat and said, There's an additional document here, A codicil, something your father added just 2 months before he passed, and the room went completely silent. David leaned forward, his brow furrowed, and said, "A codicil? What does that mean?" And Mr. Harrison said, "It means your father made a change to his will, a significant one, and I need to read it now." And I felt my heart start to race. Felt this sudden surge of hope mixed with fear because I didn't know what this meant, didn't know if it would make things better or worse. Mr. Harrison picked up another document, thinner, only a few pages, and he began reading, his voice slower now, more careful, and he said, "To my youngest daughter, whom I have not always understood, whom I have not always known how to love in the way she needed, I leave the following." And I felt tears spring to my eyes immediately. Felt my throat close up because those words, that acknowledgement, was more than I'd ever expected from him. He continued, "I leave her the full ownership of the commercial property on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, valued at approximately $12 million along with all rental income generated from said property in perpetuity." And I heard Rebecca gasp, heard her husband whisper, "What?" And I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was hearing, because that property, that building, was one of my father's most valuable assets. Something he'd bought decades ago and had generated millions in income over the years. Mr. Harrison wasn't finished, he kept reading. "I also leave her the entirety of my investment portfolio managed by Goldman Sachs, currently valued at approximately $18 million, to be transferred to her immediately upon my passing with no conditions or restrictions." And David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and he said, "That's impossible. That can't be right. He wouldn't do that." And Mr. Harrison looked at him calmly and said, "I assure you, Mr. Chen, this is your father's legal and binding will, and these are his wishes." Rebecca was shaking her head, her face had gone pale, and she looked at me with this expression of pure shock and anger, like I'd stolen something from her, like I'd done something wrong, and she said, her voice shaking, "This doesn't make sense. Why would he give her everything? She wasn't even here. She didn't care about him." And I felt anger flare up inside me, hot and sharp, because that wasn't true. I did care. I just couldn't be the person they wanted me to be. Mr. Harrison held up his hand, silencing everyone, and said, "There's more." And he read the final part, the part that made everything clear. "I have watched my youngest daughter build a life for herself without my help, without my money, without my name, and she has succeeded in ways that have humbled me and made me proud, even if I never told her so. She asked for nothing, expected nothing, and gave everything she had to causes and people who needed her. And for that reason, I am giving her what she deserves. Not as charity, but as recognition of the person she has become. A person of integrity, kindness, and strength. Qualities I failed to nurture in my other children because I gave them everything without asking them to earn it." The room was completely silent. You could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall, and I sat there, tears streaming down my face, because my father had seen me. He had understood, even if he'd never said it out loud, even if he'd never told me to my face. David sat back down, his face red, his jaw clenched, and he said nothing, just stared at the table. And Rebecca was crying now, but not the same kind of tears I was crying. Hers were angry tears, bitter tears. And she said, "This isn't fair, this isn't fair. We were here, we took care of him. We did everything he asked." And Mr. Harrison said quietly, "Your father's will is final, and it reflects his wishes, if you'd like to contest it." "That is your right, but I should inform you that he anticipated that possibility and included a clause stating that anyone who contests this will forfeits their inheritance entirely." That shut her up. That made both David and Rebecca go silent, because they knew they couldn't risk losing what they'd been given, even if it wasn't as much as they'd expected, even if they felt cheated. Mr. Harrison looked at me and said, "Your father also left you a personal letter. It's sealed, and I was instructed to give it to you privately." And he handed me a small envelope, cream-colored, with my name written in my father's handwriting. And I took it with trembling hands, held it against my chest because I couldn't open it there, not in front of them, not with everyone watching. The meeting ended shortly after that. Mr. Harrison went over some legal details, explained the process for transferring assets, scheduled follow-up appointments, and throughout it all, David and Rebecca barely looked at me. They gathered their things quickly, whispered to each other, and left without saying goodbye, and I sat there alone in that office, still holding the letter, still trying to understand what had just happened. I opened the letter later that night back in my hotel room, sitting on the edge of the bed with a glass of wine I'd ordered from room service. And my hands were shaking so badly I almost tore the paper. Inside, in my father's neat, precise handwriting, he'd written, "My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I hope you can forgive me for the years I wasted not telling you how proud I am of you." I was a stubborn man, a proud man, and I didn't know how to show love to someone who didn't need me the way your siblings did. But your independence, your strength, your refusal to take the easy path, those are the qualities I admired most. Even if I never said so. I am giving you these assets not because I want to control you, not because I expect anything in return, but because you are the only one of my children who will use them wisely, who will do good with them, who will make a difference in the world, and I want to give you the means to do that. I only wish I had done it sooner. I wish I had told you sooner that you were always enough, always more than enough, and I am sorry it took me until now to say it. I cried then, really cried. The kind of crying that comes from deep inside, from years of feeling like I wasn't good enough, like I didn't belong, and now, finally, I had proof that I did, that I mattered, that I was loved. The months that followed were strange and difficult. David and Rebecca didn't speak to me. They stopped returning my calls, blocked me on social media, acted like I didn't exist. And the rest of the family took their side, whispered about me at gatherings I was no longer invited to, said I'd manipulated my father, said I didn't deserve what he'd left me, and it hurt more than I expected. But I also realized something important. I realized that people who only value you for what you can give them were never really family to begin with. I used the money my father left me to start a foundation, something focused on helping young people who, like me, didn't fit into their families, who needed support and resources to build their own paths. And every time I signed a check, every time I met someone whose life was changed by that foundation, I thought about my father, about his letter, about how he'd seen me even when I thought he hadn't. I never went back to Connecticut, never set foot in that family home again, and I didn't need to because I'd built my own home, my own life, my own family of people who chose to love me not because of blood or money, but because of who I was. That day in the lawyer's office when Rebecca smirked at me when she thought she'd won, she didn't realize that winning isn't about getting the most money or the biggest house. It's about being loved for who you are, being valued for what you give, and knowing that you matter. And in the end, I had all of that, and she had nothing but resentment and bitterness. I learned that day that family isn't always the people you're born to, sometimes it's the people you choose, and sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. It's the knowledge that you were seen, you were valued, you were loved. And no one can ever take that away from you, no matter how hard they try.